So our first speaker is John McDowell.
It's great to be here again, the fourth time. I was planning just to start in, but I'll just say one thing. I'm on record in print calling Sebastian's book wonderful. In my view, it's almost perfect, and I thought I would say that first, because I am going to be taking issue with something in it. So almost perfect, but not quite perfect. There is a handout which I hope will help. It's quite a full handout. Matt actually did this already, but my sense was we would be missing Jim Conant's many-page handout, and I would try to do a faint shadow of that, but Matt has beaten me to it. So, the paper is in sections and the handout is in sections, and if I remember, I will tell you which section I'm in, and you can find things like quotations and summaries of what I say. Gareth Evans explains reference to oneself as oneself in terms of ways of knowing, such that my knowing in one of those ways, that some predicable is instantiated, just is my knowing that I instantiate it. There's no need or room for a separable cognition by which I identify what I know to instantiate the predicable as myself. Evans, in his chapter on I reference, mentions self-knowledge in acting as one of those ways of knowing, which he regrets having been unable to deal with properly. Sebastian Rödl follows Evans in explaining first-person reference in terms of ways of knowing that yield unmediated first-person knowledge. That's a quicker way of saying the thing I said at length. And he devotes a chapter, the second chapter of the book, to the self-knowledge of agents. That's just the introductory first section. Section 2. Self-knowledge in acting is what Anscombe, in intention, mostly means by practical knowledge. She says that to understand practical knowledge, we must first understand practical reasoning. And that sets the agenda for Sebastian's chapter. From her discussion of practical reasoning, Anscombe arrives at the idea of a special form of description of events. That's her wording. This special form to be understood in terms of an order which is there whenever actions are done with intentions. That's her wording too. The passages from which these quotations are taken are in the handout. So this order which is there whenever actions are done with intentions is present in explanations of actions that answer the question why, in the special sense that Anscombe delineates, or equivalently, this is two specifications of the order, in reasoning, by which agents determine what to do. Anscombe isn't as explicit as one might wish about how the result of her discussion of practical reasoning, which is this special form of description of events, is to help us understand practical knowledge. She said to understand practical knowledge we need to think about practical reasoning. And a simple account of how it's supposed to help might go like this. A description with that special form represents something that's happening as an action that's intentional under that description. Anscombe follows Aristotle in saying that practical reasoning concludes in acting. So, an agent's doing such and such, where doing such and such stands in for a description with that special form, is the agent's conclusion from some practical reasoning. That is, it is her answering the question what to do, in a sense in which answering a question is an act of reason, and it's practical reason in this case. As the act of reason it is, answering the question what to do is something one can't be doing without knowing how one is answering the question, which includes knowing one's ground for one's answer. So when we explain the form of description that represents happenings as actions, in terms of the order that characterizes practical reasoning, as Anscombe does, We reveal an agent's self-knowledge in acting, that is, knowledge of what she's doing and why, as an instance of a rational subject's self-knowledge in acts of her reason. Now, section 3. Sebastian would find this unsatisfactory. I think he wants to deny that, but I try to explain what I mean. He doesn't dispute Anscombe's Aristotelian doctrine that practical reasoning concludes in acting. But he thinks the first thing to say about practical reasoning is that it concludes in a thought that, his words, joins a subject with an action form in a manner that represents the latter, the action form, as to be done. Schematically, I star do A, and it helps to think of the star as standing in for should, so less schematically, I should do A. That joins the subject I with an action form in a way that represents the action form as to be done. I should do A. Sebastian writes, quotation on your handout, I'll read it out. We can define an intentional action as a movement that is a conclusion of reasoning, and I put in thereby because I think it's apt, thereby defining it as a unity of thought, that is, thought of this form, I star do A, and movement. Comprehending this unity, the unity of a thought, I star do A, and a movement, is comprehending practical reasoning. If we explain what practical reasoning is by saying it concludes in an action, we fail to make it clear that we lack this comprehension of this unity. Now, the account I gave in section 2 of Anscombe's idea depended on the claim that acting is the conclusion of practical reasoning, the one that figures in that quotation I've just read out. Sebastian thinks we may not invoke that claim until we comprehend a unity of movement with thought of the form I star do A. Then we may invoke it, but we can't invoke it straight away. And now, the account I gave in section 2 didn't even acknowledge that as a requirement, let alone contribute to discharging it. And that's what I mean by saying he oughtn't anyway to find the account I gave satisfactory. So his line is we need a prior comprehension of a unity of movement with thought of the form I star do A before we may invoke the Aristotelian doctrine that acting is the conclusion of practical reasoning. And he thinks we need that comprehension because, as I said, he believes the question addressed by practical reasoning is answered by thoughts of the form I star do A. Now, I think that belief's wrong. It conflicts with something fundamental to Anscombe's account of practical reasoning, and I think Anscombe's right about this. I'm in section 4. Forget if I mentioned that. More quotations. So Anscombe begins her account of practical reasoning by saying that its true character, the true character of practical reasoning, which she calls one of Aristotle's best discoveries, is obscured if one conceives it as reasoning towards the truth of a proposition. And she makes it clear that we don't meet her point if the proposition towards whose truth we conceive a practical reasoner as reasoning is one that, and now I repeat Sebastian's words, joins a subject with an action form in a manner that represents the latter, the action form, as to be done. Anscombe dismisses the idea that we can exemplify practical reasoning by reasoning that concludes in a thought like, I ought to give this man money, or should I give this man money. She dismisses that idea. As I said, I think Anscombe's right about this. Aristotle's discovery, as she calls it, can be expressed by distinguishing two kinds of assent, two modes of saying yes to something. Assent to thoughts and assent to actions. That has to be qualified as an act of reason. Assenting to an action, that is, acting, is itself a thought, in a broader sense than the one that figures in the specification of the contrast that I just gave. But assent to a proposition, even a proposition that predicates an action form of a subject as what is to be done isn't practical assent, just because it's assent to a proposition. No doubt there's a sense in which should thoughts are practical, but that doesn't make any difference to Anscombe's thinking, as she shows when she rejects the example of reasoning that concludes, I ought to give this man money. If she's right, we can't reconstruct the Aristotelian idea of a distinctively practical assent in terms of a unity of a movement with a should thought, a thought of the form, I star do A. Sebastian writes, quotations on your handout under section 4, a term of reasoning, well, for instance a conclusion, is an act of applying concepts, that is, a thought in the broad sense in which we speak of practical and theoretical thought. But thoughts in that broad sense are not to be identified with acts of applying concepts. A practical assent, which is an acting, right? A practical assent is a thought in the broad sense. It's a term of reasoning. It's an act of reason. But it's not an act of applying concepts in whatever mode of application. It's an act of realizing concepts. Now into section 5, if you're following along with the quotations. Certainly concept application has a place in an account of practical assent. What I practically assent to is, for instance, my doing A. And that's a nominalization of a proposition in which I would apply the action form do A to myself in the form I am doing A. But that's not to say my assenting to my doing A is my thinking a thought of that form. And Sebastian thinks it is. Sebastian says the form I am doing A, when it expresses self-knowledge had by someone who's doing A intentionally, is a guise of the form I star do A. If that were right, thinking I am doing A could be the act of concept application whose unity with a movement he thinks is constitutive of doing A intentionally. And if that were right, thinking I am doing A would be the thought, in the broad sense, that's practically assenting to doing A. But even leaving aside for the moment the thesis I'm querying, the thesis that practical reasoning concludes in an act of concept application, it seems wrong to hold that I am doing A is a guise of I star do A. In thinking I am doing A, if I am doing A, expressive of my self-knowledge as an agent, I predicate the action form do A of myself as what I'm doing, not as what is to be done, which is the explanation of I star do A. Now, Sebastian thinks predicating the action form of myself as what I'm doing is predicating it of myself as what is to be done. But I think that reflects the misconception that leads him to miss what I tendentiously call Anscombe's insight. Practical reasoning is not reasoning to the truth of a proposition. Now, section 6. Sebastian says to do in what to do is a gerundive. And that would validate his belief that the question what to do is answered by thoughts in which one predicates an action form of oneself as what is to be done. But to do isn't a gerundive, it's an infinitive. It's so picky, it's high school, elementary school grammar, it's an infinitive. It's true that gerundive forms matter to the understanding of phrases like the question what to do. But that's not because to do in that context becomes a gerundive so that the question what to do can be equated with the question what is to be done. It makes a difference that the infinitive occurs in that context, the question what to do. But the difference is that, as I said, gerundive forms need to figure in a certain way in an understanding of the question, not that they give the form of answers to it. Here's how gerundive forms relate to the question what to do. quick sketch of it anyway. Answering the question what to do is, for instance, doing A, Aristotelian doctrine, acting. If someone is doing A on grounds set out in reasoning that leads her to answer the question what to do in that way by doing A, she thinks A is good for her to do, or she should do A, she star do A. The she is Castaneda's starred she. She thinks I star do A in the light of those grounds. And now, this is in the neighborhood of a claim of Sebastian's. It's not just that the antecedent of that conditional predicative, it again entails the consequent. Right? The condition was if someone is doing A on grounds set out in a bit of practical reasoning. She thinks I star do A in the light of those grounds. Right? If then. It isn't just that the antecedent entails the consequent. The agent's thinking A is good for her to do, thinking I star do A, is not a separate reality from her doing A with a true explanation of the relevant kind. What it is for her to be doing A with a true action explanation, that's just more wording for the same thing, explanation of the relevant kind, includes her thinking A is good for her to do, her thinking I star do A. But where I said not a separate reality, right, that thinking I star do A is not a separate reality from doing A on the grounds on which one thinks I star do A, I said not a separate reality. Sebastian says the same reality. Quotation on your handout under 6. If someone's doing something, has a true action explanation, then her doing it and her thought that it is good to do are the same reality. Now, that implies that what it is for someone to be doing A with a true action explanation is her thinking A is good for her to do, not includes it, right, as I said. And by my lights, that's unwarranted. Not a separate reality is what we should say. The same reality we should not say, right? That thinking I star do A is not distinct from doing A on the relevant grounds, but it's not the same thing. Identifying doing A and thinking I star do A on the grounds on which one does A implies that thinking I star do A, thinking A is good for me to do, gives the form of conclusions of practical reasoning. And that conflicts with what I'm going on calling Anscombe's insight. Now, something similar goes for the relation between doing A and thinking I am doing A. That was about the relation between doing A and thinking I star do A. So another conditional with the same kind of general shape as the one I was talking about. If someone is doing A with a true action explanation, she thinks, indeed she knows, I am doing A. More fully, I am doing A because blank, where the because clause gives the explanation. I actually believe there are cases in which that's not true. Someone can be doing A with a true action explanation, but not know she's succeeding in doing it. It really matters that I put in succeeding. But those cases are at best marginal. I'll just leave them aside and pretend that the conditional I enunciated is okay. If someone is doing A with a true action explanation, she thinks, I am doing A because blank, and fill in the explanation. In fact, she knows that. Now, as before, as with the relation between doing A and thinking I star do A, the agent's thinking, indeed knowing, I am doing A because, fill in the explanation, is not a separate reality from her doing A because, fill in the explanation. What it is for her to be doing A with a true action explanation includes her thinking, I am doing A because, fill in the explanation. And here again, it's wrong to replace includes with is, conflate not a separate reality with the same reality, and equate her doing A because, fill in the explanation, with her thinking, I am doing A because. my pages. If doing A with a true action explanation were the same reality as thinking I star do A because blank, fill in the explanation, and also the same reality as thinking I am doing A because fill in the explanation, then by a transitivity of identity, we could vindicate Sebastian's thesis that I am doing A as a guise of I star do A. Doing A is thinking at either of those, it doesn't matter which you say. But the equations are wrong. What it is to be doing A includes thinking each of those things, not is. So there's no vindication of the thesis that I am doing A as a guise of I star do A to be had like that. Okay, now I'm to section 8, which kind of brings the first phase of my paper to a close. I hope you'll see why I say that when I get on to the second phase. So Sebastian aims in his chapter to explain practical knowledge as an element in an Evans-inspired account of first-person reference. It's one of these ways of knowing that some predicable is instantiated such that. Knowing that a predicable is instantiated in that way just is knowing that you yourself, kind of Castaneda pronoun, instantiated. And if this explanation, if this making practical knowledge available to serve the purpose of being part of the explanation of first-person reference, if this explanation required accepting that practical reasoning has as its conclusions thoughts of the form I star do A, well then there'd be reason to doubt that what I've found in Anscombe and have been calling an insight is an insight. We need this reasoning towards the truth of star propositions in the account of how practical knowing serves its purpose in an account of first-person reference. But the identification is unnecessary for the project, and I think that really comes out in the long quotation under 8 in your handout. This is from near the end of the chapter, where Sebastian is giving a summary of how he's executed its major project, making practical knowing available as an Evans-type way of knowing. So, long quotation, I'll read it. We seek an account of first-person reference. This is actually general, what's going on in this and the next chapter both. We seek an account of first-person reference of the logical perspective it affords on an object, which consists in a relationship with the object by which one knows how things stand with it in such a way that acts of knowing the object in this way are unmediated first-person thoughts. Yes. So we're looking for a way of knowing that satisfies this condition, the following condition. When I know an object in this way, then there's no room for asking whether I am that object. That is, first-person thoughts articulating such knowledge are identification-free, and that's all been explained in the first chapter. Now, we've described a way of knowing of which this holds true. That last thing holds true. Knowing that I'm doing something by concluding I should do it. When I know that someone is doing something through reasoning about what to do, then there's no room for the question whether it is I of whom I know this. One way of knowing from the inside that someone is doing something, which founds the first-person reference of a subject of action, is knowing it from reasoning about what to do. That's repeating the previous sentence, repeating the thought expressed in the previous sentence. Now, one sentence in that passage reflects the identification that I'm objecting to. The next sentence back, right, the third sentence from the end. Sebastian writes as if knowing that I'm doing something by concluding I should do it were just different wording for knowing that I'm doing something through reasoning about what to do. Both those wordings figure in the last 3 sentences of the passage. But the passage doesn't need the former wording. It doesn't need the wording with the should in it. What explains how it is that acts of practical knowledge are unmediated first-person thoughts is that in practical knowing, I know I'm doing something by virtue of the fact that my doing it is my answering the question what to do. That's the wording in the last two sentences of the passage. The equation of the question what to do with the question what I should do does no work in the explanation. Now, coming off from the text, which some of you have, much work is done in the explanation by the fact that thinking I star do A on the grounds on which one does A figures in an account of doing A. But not a separate reality is enough. The same reality misses things. Okay, section 9. The equation, same reality. Doing A is the same reality as thinking I star do A. Shapes the first section of the chapter, where Sebastian argues that to understand reasoning directed at answering the question what to do, we need a system of forms of answers to the question. If it were correct to identify the question what to do asked by me with the question what I should do, there would be as many forms of answers to the question what to do as there are measures that can interpret that should. Right, should in the question what I should do. And if measures for what I should do are just a heap, an unsystematic miscellany, Sebastian's identification of the questions would require us to conclude, a nasty conclusion, that there's no unity in our thought of doing something intentionally. That's a sketch of the grounds on which he sets out to, now this is a quote, to develop a system of forms of statements that answer the question what to do. Equating that with a system of forms of statements that answer an agent's question what she should do. Well, a quick sketch of what goes on in this section of the chapter. He begins with instrumental syllogisms, about which he says, I quote, "Instrumental reasoning leads from one answer to the practical question to another. It does not make explicit the measure of this question." And on that ground, he argues, again I quote, "There must be another way of answering the question that the instrumental syllogism answers, which reveals the measure the question invokes." The instrumental syllogism starts from something that's already an answer to the question. So there must be another way. The first candidate he considers is calculation from desire, and he rejects that on the ground that, again I'm frequently quoting here, the conclusion of a calculation from desire expresses a state to which any duration is accidental. That, a state to which duration is accidental, doesn't have the right temporal form to give the measure of reasoning whose conclusion has the temporal form of an action. For that, and this is the final stage of this section of the chapter, for that, Sebastian argues, we need reasoning that reveals an action form as manifesting an infinite end to which one adheres. So he concludes, infinite ends are the order that defines the question what to do. More precisely, the order of this question, the question what to do, is an objective unity of infinite ends, which we shall call a practical life form. There's 9, that was just describing what goes on in the first section of the chapter, the first big section of the chapter. 10. Now, I've disputed Sebastian's conception of how thought about what to do relates to thought about what one should do. And if I'm right, the point undermines the motivation for this project, looking for a system of forms of answers to the question what to do. I'll quote a passage again that I quoted in section 9. He wants a system of forms of statements that answer the question what to do, and I insert i.e., I think it's fair, statements that fill the blank in I star do A because, and the because is completed by the explanation of one's doing A. But Anscombe's insight is that answers to the question what to do aren't statements, right? It's a system of forms of statements that answer the question what, there are no statements that answer the question what to do. Reasoning, answering the question what to do, concludes in acting. Acting isn't predicating, applying concepts to realizing concepts. The other thing in this implicit equation, completions of I star do A because, those are statements, all right. They express recognition of grounds for doing A. And though, as I insisted, recognizing grounds for doing A is not a separate reality from answering the question what to do by doing A on those grounds, it's not the same reality. Even if the grounds are, as we can sometimes say, compelling, acting on them is an act of will that goes beyond recognizing them. That's just an attempt to say again the difference between not a separate reality, my approved formulation of what he should be saying, and the same reality. The form of answers to the question what to do, and I say the form of answers to questions what to do, can be explained directly without the detour through a system of forms of answers to the question what one should do. To answer the question what to do is to realize an action form. The form of answers to the question what to do is given by the concept of an action form. Sebastian himself notes in a really helpful section of the chapter that action forms are a species of movements, kinesis, objects of thought, and now I quote, whose predication exhibits not only the contrast of past and present, that's state predications have that, but also the contrast of progressive and perfective aspect. I am doing A, I have done A. Action forms, well, that's the action forms in particular, but kineses have that contrast. Action forms have, as such, the temporal form of movements. They don't need to acquire the right temporal form from the grounds on which agents realize them. But it's true that action forms are a species of that mode of temporality. But their being action forms needs to be understood in terms of the order Anscombe elicits from her discussion of practical reason. That's a way of getting at her point in saying to understand practical knowing, we need to understand practical reason. But it doesn't follow that the concept of acting has to owe its unity to a system that unifies varieties of the order found in practical reasoning. It can be the other way round. Measures of grounds for acting can be a miscellany. They need no system, no unity, beyond the fact that realizing action forms is what grounds for acting are grounds for. That's kind of too terse and probably not right, but leave it at that. So, 11 now. I was in 10 questioning the motivation for the project of developing a system of forms of answers to the question what to do. The motivation hinges on equating that idea with the idea of a system of forms of answers to the question what I should do. And for the rest of what I'm going to say, I want to point to what strike me as off notes in his execution of this project, the motivation for which I've been questioning. Anscombe identifies the order of action explanation with the order of practical reasoning. Sebastian interprets that identification by Anscombe as restricted to instrumental syllogisms in the sense he works with, the sense of reasoning that begins from something that's already an answer to the question what to do, moves to another answer to the question what to do. And so it can't cast light on what it is to answer the question what to do because it starts with something that already is such an answer. But I think this misconstrues the identity of order that Anscombe finds between action explanation and practical reasoning. Action explanations display an order expressible by in order to. An explanation of an action terminates in an end that the agent is pursuing. I'm thinking of, it might come in succession. Why are you doing A? In order to do B, which in some cases might be because I am doing B. Why are you doing B? In order to do C, because I am doing C. And at some point it stops. the termination is an end that the agent is pursuing. That's right. An agent's pursuing the end that gives the answer to the last of a series of why questions is itself an answer of hers to the question what to do. Because I am, right, pursuing such and such an end. So it might seem that practical reasoning corresponding to such explanations must be, as Sebastian takes Anscombe to hold, reasoning from one answer to the question what to do, the answer constituted by pursuing the end that terminates the series of why questions, to another answer, the conclusion of the reasoning. So hopeless starts from something that's already an answer to the question, cannot show us what it is to answer the question. But practical reasoning, whose order is the order of a potential action explanation, can start from the end in which the explanation would terminate, same thought there, not as something one is pursuing, but as something that's worthy of pursuit. Then it's only in realizing an action form as the conclusion of such reasoning that one is responding to the pursuit worthiness of the end by pursuing it. Recognizing that an end is worthy of pursuit isn't the same as pursuing it. It isn't itself an answer to the question, what to do. Reasoning from the pursuit worthiness of an end to realizing an action form isn't reasoning from one answer to the question, what to do, to another. So the argument doesn't start, right? We need another a mode of reasoning that is answering the question what to do, not starting from something that isn't. The line of thought doesn't even begin. However, I will go on running through it. Section 12 now. Sebastian's treatment of calculation from desire is designed to bring out that an answer to the question what to do can't have its sense determined by a property of the subject to which any duration is accidental, that is, a state. He reads such a conception of how the sense of an answer to the question what to do should be determined into Donald Davidson. Now, I hold no brief for Davidson. I think Davidson goes wrong in all kinds of ways. But I think this is a misreading of him, and it may be instructive to say why. On Davidson's account, practical reasoning derives an answer to the question what to do from a judgment that acting in a certain way is desirable insofar as blank. Or maybe starting further back from a judgment whose content completes the blank in the insofar as clause. So a judgment that such and such is the case, to a judgment that acting in a certain way is desirable insofar as such and such is the case, starts from that and derives an answer to the question what to do. Davidson thinks practical reasoning concludes in judgments that acting in certain ways is desirable sans phrase, desirable all out, as opposed to desirable insofar as fill in some blank. And like Sebastian's conception, that misses what I'm continuing to call Anscombe's insight. It construes practical reasoning as reasoning towards the truth of a proposition, acting in such and such a way is desirable, all out. But that's inessential to the point I want to insist on, which is that in Davidson's view, answers to the question what to do are grounded in judgments of desirability, as it happens, desirability insofar as. The desirability, put in insofar as blank, of acting in a certain way isn't a property of the subject of practical reasoning at all. A fortiori, not one to which any duration is accidental. Sebastian does violence to Davidson, I think, by reading such an idea into him, where Davidson has desirabilities grounding answers to the question what to do. Sebastian's reading substitutes desires. Where Davidson has judgments of desirability as premises of practical reasoning, Sebastian's reasoning substitutes self-ascriptions of desires. And that's not Davidson's idea. It's true that Davidson thinks a statement of desirability can be an expression of desire. But a statement can express desire in the sense in which Davidson thinks that, without being an attribution of desire to oneself. Of course, a judgment that something is desirable won't figure in someone's practical reasoning unless she finds the thing desirable. But her premise is that it is desirable, not that she finds it desirable, let alone that she desires it. In judgments of desirability, all things considered, there's still an insofar as clause, but the insofar as clause contains everything that the subject takes to bear on the question whether acting in the relevant way is desirable. And Davidson propounds a principle of continence. Answers to the question what to do should be grounded on judgments of desirability, all things considered, rather than judgments of desirability in which the insofar as clause contains only some of what the subject takes to bear on the desirability of acting in the relevant way. Now, Sebastian reads that in a way that's shaped by his saddling Davidson with the idea that answers to the question what to do are grounded on desires, and also by his own idea, which I think isn't Davidson's, that the sense of answers to the question what to do is given by how they're grounded. So with the first account, the sense of answers to the question what to do is given by desires, all things considered. The result is that what he makes of Davidson's principle of incontinence, which as I stated it looks to me to be innocuous, is that the sense of an answer to the question what to do is given by the direction in which the agent's desires, taken together, point, and then we have to say at the time at which the question is asked, because this is a state of the subject to which duration is accidental. It can lapse at any moment. Has no trouble showing that that's hopeless, but I don't think it has anything to do with Davidson. In a way, wrangling about how to read Davidson isn't to the point. What he's doing in this part of this section of the chapter is showing that the sense of answer to the question what to do can't be given by overall states of desire. That seems to me just fine. Not fair to hang, showing that it's just that's showing that on a reading of Davidson. Okay, section 13. In Sebastian's reading of Davidson, answers to the question what to do are grounded on temporal properties of the subject of practical reasoning, desires. And I think that idea controls his own treatment of reasoning from infinite ends, and that's why I suggested that wrangling with him over the reading of Davidson might be instructive. Sebastian construes reasoning from an infinite end as starting from, and I'll use his word again, the subject's adhering to it. He conceives that as a property of the subject with a temporality to which duration isn't accidental. All right, so not like a desire. That's how he represents reasoning from infinite ends as improving on the conception of practical reasoning that he attributes to Davidson, which I agree is hopeless. I mean, if the sense of the idea that the sense of an answer to the question what to do is given by overall states of desire is useless. Now, back in section 11 about instrumental reasoning, I noted that reasoning corresponding to action explanations, in the way Anscombe exploits, can start from the pursuit worthiness of an end rather than from the subject's pursuing it. And that point's neutral as between finite and infinite ends. I said it about ends in general back then, right? Finite, infinite. Right? To me, it seems wrong to suppose that reasoning from an infinite end starts from a property of the subject, her adhering to it. Reasoning from an infinite end starts from the pursuit worthiness of the end. Since the end is infinite, that pursuit worthiness has a distinctive relation to actions it grounds, and that distinctive relation is spelled out in Sebastian's introduction of the idea of infinite ends. He's right that states of desire, all things considered, can't give the sense of answers to the question what to do. If we thought they could, we'd be committed to supposing that the question whether to do A needs to be raised afresh at every moment during one's intentionally doing A. And that wrecks the very idea of intentionally doing A. But things look different if we take practical reasoning to start from pursuit worthiness rather than pursuit. Someone's sense of the relevant pursuit worthinesses may change before she's finished executing an intention to do A. If she stops accepting the pursuit worthinesses that were her ground for doing A, she should give up the intention, leave off doing A, or maybe find a different ground for the intention. It would be pig-headed just to go on doing A if you lost your sense of what the point of doing A was while you were at it. That's to say, the question whether to do A can be reopened during one's doing A. And that's unproblematic. That doesn't have the destructive implication of the conception that Sebastian finds in Davidson. I agree, it's devastating. The implication that the question whether to do A just is open throughout one's doing A. At every moment during one's doing A, the question is open. It can be reopened. That's completely different. And now, the difference between finite and infinite ends makes no difference to that. Even if one's doing A is grounded on an infinite end, there can be no guarantee that one will go on being persuaded by the reasoning that led one to do A. If an end is infinite, in the sense that Sebastian explains, that doesn't ensure that one won't stop adhering to it. Or one may become persuaded by grounds for doing something else, provided by a different infinite end. With infinite ends no less than with finite ends, the question whether to do A can be reopened during one's doing A. And as before, that doesn't imply what would be disastrous, that the question whether to do A is open at any moment during one's doing A. There's no problem here, but that isn't because of something special to infinite ends. Sebastian, in a footnote, cites Anscombe, remarking that infinite ends are characteristic of human conduct. And that looks clearly right, and it doesn't look like something contingent. But its non-contingent character isn't explained by the place of infinite ends in Sebastian's system of answers to the question, what to do. Okay, one more section, 14. According to Sebastian, what defines the question what to do isn't just infinite ends, but an objective unity of them. That's the idea of the practical life form. Now, many people have thought there's an irreducible plurality of, let me say, ultimate values. Terminology of infinite ends is maybe unfamiliar. Ultimate values which make conflict. It seems implausible that that could be shown to be wrong by an abstract inquiry into what it is to answer the question what to do. I think this aspect of Sebastian's thinking is another reflection of the way he misconceives the relation between the question what to do and the question what one should do. Where he says answering the one is the same reality as answering the other. And I say he should say it's not a separate reality from answering the other. If we suppose with Sebastian that answering the question what to do is the same reality as answering a question what one should do, then it'll seem that to determine what to do in a situation in which there are two infinite ends, such that one might act in furtherance of either, but not both of them, one would need to determine what one should do with a should whose measure is not given by either of these ends. The equation of the questions makes that seem to be so. But there doesn't need to be any such should. By the lights of one of the ends, one should do, say, A. By the lights of the other, one should do, say, B. If one does A, one's action is grounded on one of the ends. If one does B, it's grounded on the other. Either way, one acts for a reason, the reason being given by the end that one is furthering in acting as one does. There can be situations in which one has to choose which reason to act for, with no overarching should, to determine one's choice. That's what the people who think plurality of ultimate values think. That's no threat to the idea that practical reason is a capacity to answer the question what to do. That is, to act for reasons. We just have to acknowledge that practical reason includes the capacity for such choice and choosing which reason to act for. Sebastian cites my reading of the Socratic doctrine that virtue is one. I argued that the doctrine can't be refuted on the ground that the ends characteristic of the individual virtues may conflict. Because a defender of the doctrine can insist that where there seems to be such a conflict, the situation is better described by saying only one of the ends actually bears on the question what virtue requires. But now, that gives no positive reason to accept the Socratic doctrine. It gives a method for refusing to accept purported counterexamples to it, but not a positive reason for accepting it. A positive reason for accepting it would require a ground for believing that a redescription like that, this end which you think demands your practical attention, actually does not bear on the situation. It would require a ground for believing that such redescription will always do justice to the claims of the ends that it sets aside, that it declares not to bear on the situation. Sebastian thinks he's provided a positive reason to hold that infinite ends in general, not just the ends characteristic of the individual virtues, must form a unity. But his argument depends on what I've urged is a misconception of what it is to answer the question, what to do. Thank you.